topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Alise Cortez.
Hi there. Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in again this week. It's great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, joining you live from Dallas, which is home base for me. If you don't know me yet, I'm a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, organizational logotherapist, inspirational speaker, social scientist, and author. My team and I help companies discover and articulate their purpose to thread it through culture and operations. And we work with forward-thinking or forward-reaching organizations to develop inspirational leaders who create cultures where people actually want to come to work and do their best. And we provide programs like the Grab Your Gusto that enable individual team members to discover and unleash their passion and purpose at work to catalyze fulfillment, engagement, and productivity. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at alisecortez.com. With us today is Lynda Gratton. She is one of the foremost global thought leaders on the future of work, named by Business Thinkers 50 as one of the top 15 business thinkers and described as a rock star teacher. Lynda is Professor of Management Practice at London Business School, where she received the Teacher of the Year Award and designed and directs the Future of Work elective, one of the school's most popular electives. She's the author of Redesigning Work, How to Transform Your Organization and Make Hybrid Work for Everyone. She lives in London, but is joining us today from New York. Lynda and Professor Gratton, welcome to Working on Purpose in the United States.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alise. Very pleased to be with you today.
It's so wonderful. As you know, I love your book. Look at this gorgeous thing. Look at this, Redesigning Work.
Yeah. Can you see I'm actually wearing, I'm sort of slightly color coordinated with it.
I think it's brilliant, just like you. As I said before we got on air together, I've been hosting the show for 7 years, and I have been graced with people like you who have really lifted my understanding of the world of life and work. And I really love what you have done.
Thank you, Alise.
Yes, it's beautiful. So let's get into it here. I only get you for about 50 minutes here. So I want to talk about a few things that I haven't really spoken about before. So this show is curated. So what that means for me is that I really only discuss things on the show that we haven't already really touched upon very much. Mm. So we build. In other words, it's a build. Mm. So I captured some different aspects of your book that I want to talk over. So you say right out of the gate, before the pandemic, faced with automation as well as demographic and social shifts, some companies had already begun to unfreeze. Mm-hmm. And they had realized that automation would require employees to rapidly upskill or even reskill to completely to different roles. And this required learning at a premium. But the other thing about it here is that's so interesting, right, is that this opportunity to, as you say, for employees to dip in and out of work and start maybe a business on the side, go back and get education, travel the world. You're the first person that I've encountered, Professor, who really talks about this really ebb and flow and this new societal structure. So I want to start there. Okay. What's going on, right, in the world where we now are living like this?
Well, thank you for that great question, Alise. And here's the thing. I've been studying the world of work for more than 30 years at London Business School. And my book, Redesigning Work, is really a book around the pandemic. But let's go back before the pandemic, because I think that's really where you want to start. And I think it's a great place to start. Mm-hmm. So I study the way that trends are shifting what we think about work. And let me just very briefly describe 3 trends that had already shifted work. The first is technology. I mean, we all know, and we can see it in our everyday life, that, that technology with it, be it artificial intelligence or robotics, is taking some of our work away. It's not, by the way, destroying everybody's job. And the idea that, robots are going to destroy all our jobs is completely wrong. But what it does do is it takes parts of our jobs and hopefully leaves us with other bits that we can then get better at. So this was already in play. The second, which I don't think people understood as well as they might have done, is about demographic change. And two things to say about that. I wrote 2 books, one called The 100-Year Life, one called The New Long Life, with an economist. I'm a psychologist. So this was a very unusual pairing of disciplines. But what we found is as people live longer, unless they save a lot, and let's face it, most of us don't, we need to work longer. Now, I know politicians are afraid to tell you, and you can see this in France at the moment, that the retirement age has to go up, but it will. And working into your 60s and 70s is going to be a reality for lots of people. And then the third piece is really about families and societies. The fact that honestly, most women now work, that means that most families, if they have 2 people leading them, both of them are going to be working. And that's very different from the sort of family I grew up in, where, my dad worked and my mum stayed at home. This is a very unusual family structure these days. So if you put those three things together, one of the things I said in my book, The 100-Year Life, which by the way has sold more than 1 million copies. I'm very proud of that. Bravo. Thank you. Mostly in Japan, I have to say. Japan is a huge reader of my books. Anyway, those 3 things together said, we have to move from a 3-stage life, which is full-time education, full-time work, and full-time retirement, to what Andrew Scott, my co-author, and I called a multi-stage life, where you do there's more stages in it. And as you said earlier, starting your own business, traveling the world, learning a new skill, spending time with your kids, whatever that is. And at the same time, there's more transition. So we were talking about this before the pandemic. But whilst, as you said, I saw some organizations trying to rethink work, most honestly hadn't. And for me, the most astonishing aspect of the pandemic is that on the 23rd of March, 2020, which is where it really hit the UK, but of course it had been hitting other countries a little bit earlier, but only a week or two, companies actually totally changed, and they unfroze, as it were, not just 1 or 2 companies, but every single company around the world. My research center has within it companies in Australia, US, Japan, China, and Europe. And we actually saw this being played out, Alise. We actually, every day, we could hear one of them saying, we're moving everybody back into their homes. And so we all moved into what was an astonishing experiment. And one of the ways I like to think of it, Alise, is it's as if you're watching a show at the moment, and we're sort of on, series 2, episode 3, and there's still a lot more episodes to go. So even if we think, okay, job done, we can all go back to how we were before the pandemic, the truth is there's still a lot more episodes to go. And I keep a journal. I'm now on, journal 18. I've kept a journal since the very first day. And you can actually see the evolution of how people are thinking about these new ways of working, both if they're leading organizations, but of course, also if they're employees themselves. And new unexpected events are happening. So for example, the new unexpected event was, who would have predicted we would have a war for talent now? Most people said there's going to be mass unemployment. There isn't. There's a war for talent. So there's a lot of unpredictable events arising. And what's very fascinating is the way that organizations are thinking about that and preparing for that. So we are definitely series 2, episode 3.
Well said. What a way to kick us off. Yeah. Okay, so that was all sort of, that's sort of like the preamble, if you will, to kind of where we are today. And the thing that I want to talk about next that I think is critical to this transformation in the workplace is that part of the reason that you say in your book, which again is brilliant, because I don't think anybody else has actually said this, is part of the reason that we can actually have this transformation, this evolution of work today, is because during the pandemic, the leaders were thrown into the mix themselves, right alongside with the coworkers. They were the ones that were sheltered in place and stuck and lost. And so, as you say in your book, the veil of ignorance was lifted. They got first line view of what it is to be an actual worker. And that has given them a whole different sense of empathy to be able to change and evolve and flex the workplace.
I so agree, Alise. And I think, the unsung heroes really of the whole pandemic were the technology companies that put our platforms in place, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and so on. I honestly think if this had been 10 years earlier, we wouldn't have had the productivity, not just the productivity, actually the productivity gains that we've had during the pandemic. And as you say, one of the most interesting things is that normally in an organization, the leader, is dressed in their sort of leadership clothes. They stand at the top of something rather, a large room or, a platform, and they address everybody. But of course, on Microsoft Teams or Zoom, everybody's the same size.
Interesting.
Everybody's the same size. Each one of us is the same size. And suddenly you saw your CEOs wearing, their normal at-home gear, and you saw them with their children and dogs and cats and goodness knows what. And what that did, I think, Alise, is it actually broke down a lot of the boundaries between being a leader and being a follower or an employee. And it meant that both, as you say, leaders could then begin to see what it was like as an employee, because they were looking into people's lives and at the same time, the employees were looking into their lives.
Yes.
And what we've seen is some leaders have absolutely been brilliant at stepping up to that. And some have really struggled with it. But that said, and I'm sure we'll have a chance, Alise, to talk about this perhaps later on in the program, but there's a lot of strain being now. If I were to look at my journal for the last couple of weeks, I'm hearing a lot about, I did a piece just this morning with people all over the world at London Business School. I did a Zoom link. Mental health is a big issue right now. People are very tired. They're zoomed out. So, as we move into this next episode, as it were, we do have to think about how we're going to get back to work in a way that helps people thrive, helps them to stay healthy and happy. And that, for me, is the challenge that we're facing right now.
Mm-hmm. And the opportunity. So
the opportunity.
Right. So what you say in your book, which is, I'm going to quote you here. It says, you've said, we've had a chance to question many fundamental assumptions, adopt new habits, and form new narratives of how work gets done. We've learned new vital lessons from this time of unfreeze. We are now faced with some significant choices. Do we go back to our old ways of working, or do we use this as an opportunity to completely redesign work and make it more purposeful, productive, and fulfilling for all? Yeah. I want to go with the latter, if you don't mind.
Oh, me too. And actually, Alise, you of course, you write books as well. So that getting a book out at the right time is really important. Mm-hmm. And I worked, so hard because I only started writing this in sort of March or April of 2021. Me, Penguin, my publisher, MIT Press, my publisher in the US, worked as hard as they could to get it out sort of this week, really. It came out in the UK last week. It's coming out in America in the beginning of May. And the reason we did that is I just couldn't bear the thought of everybody going back to how they were. What a lost opportunity. So
absolutely.
I wanted to get my voice across as an academic who studies work and saying to companies right now, as they're beginning to say, I think we'll just go back to how we were. So say, no, please, no, don't go back to how you were. So that's why I'm so thrilled that the book is out as now, because it's a book that basically says to everyone, an employee, a team leader, an executive, experiment. Let's try new things out. Let's see if they work. Let's see what sticks. And some of the great companies right now, and in the book, you probably realize I have lots and lots of examples.
You do.
What companies are doing, some of which are sort of wacky and amazing, but all of them are examples where experiments where you go, oh, that's interesting. That I wonder if we should think about something like that. So it's really an invitation to play.
It's delightful. So a couple more things before we hit our first break that I want to position for our listeners and our viewers here. So if you could just talk high level about your 4-step that process of redesigning work. That's important for listeners to kind of have on their head before we go into our break.
Yeah, well, thank you. So one of the questions people asked me right at the beginning was, well, what's best practice? And the truth is there isn't a best practice. Every company has to find its own signature. So then the question is, well, how do you do that? And that's what my 4 steps are about. And anybody who's listening who knows about systems thinking and design thinking, I'm sure many of your listeners do, you'll go, oh, I recognize that, Lynda, from systems thinking. And you're right, it is. So here it is. Number 1, understand what's going on in your organization and understand the jobs, the people, the networks. Number 2, reimagine, step back and say, let's experiment around time, but also around place. The third is then check it out. Let's just make sure that it's not, it actually helps our purpose. It's not unfair. It really helps people to be better than they could be. And then the 4th step is let's move into action and make this happen. And for me, the big players in terms of action are leaders in terms of the narrative, the stories they tell. Very important role for team leaders and managers in actually getting agreement on how we make this work. Because in the next piece, I'm sure we'll hear how hard it can be. And thirdly, employees and listening to employees turns out to be absolutely crucial. So those 4 steps, which take you through a design process, which take you from understanding to a reimagining to just checking it out in terms of, is this the right things we should be doing? And then actioning. That's a step that we should all be going through right now.
Delightful. Perfect way for us to let them sit for just a second while we grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We're on the air with Professor Lynda Gratton. She's the author of Redesigning Work, How to Transform Your Organization and Make Hybrid Work for Everyone. We've been talking a bit about just the stage of how we got to where we are today. We're going to continue our conversation on being able to redesign that workplace so that it's better for everyone. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to the program. Before we get back to Professor Gratton, I do want to invite you to check out my first book that came out, Purpose Ignited. I really wrote that book to awaken readers to their passion and purpose and transform them into inspirational leaders that can actually elevate and enliven their workforces. So I hope you'll check it out. That's the basis of the Vitally Inspired program that I have, as well as the Grab Your Gusto. If you're just joining us today, my guest is Lynda Gratton. She's the Professor of Management Practice of London Business School, where she received the Teacher of the Year Award and designed and directs the Future of Work elective, one of the school's most popular electives. She's the author of Redesigning Work, How to Transform Your Organization and Make Hybrid Work for Everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. So before we get back into some more of the content that I just think is so just juicy and just chewy and yummy, let's also talk about what you talk about. There's 4 elements of productivity, and this is important because as we go into the conversation further, that we presence them. So you talk about them being energy, focus, coordination, and cooperation.
Okay, so as you think about how to redesign work, and I think the invitation that I'm going to make now, and I make in the book, is everybody should be asking themselves, how do I design work so it works for me? Mm-hmm. Lots of companies think the first question is, what do people want? But I'm old and experienced enough Alise, to know that if we simply design companies around what people want, then in the next downturn, and it looks as if that's going to be quite soon, a CEO just pulls everything back out. They just, all the processes that they've brought in get pulled out. So the number one question has to be, how do I help myself and my team be more productive? And so the focus is on productivity. And the question then is, what helps you? What do you do in your work that helps you to be productive? And I've pulled out, as you said, 4 elements of work. Some of the work we do, you need high levels of energy. Some need a lot of focus. So you're doing focused tasks. So for example, if you're in a job where you find yourself thinking about stuff, reading stuff, maybe writing reports, perhaps doing strategic work, that's what I called focus work. The next is coordination, where you're perhaps, with a team, you're coordinating your projects, you're giving feedback, you're finding out where you've got with it. And the third is cooperation, which is where you're working with a group in a creative, innovative way to come up with some new solutions. Now, it turns out that each one of those requires a different configuration of time and place. So let's look at cooperation. And we maybe talk about this in a moment, Alise, but right now, the view is that if you want to be highly creative and innovative, being face-to-face is really a good thing. So you could say, when I'm in the office, the work I'm doing is really about cooperation. And that really talks a lot about how do we redesign offices to make them places of cooperation. The second I spoke about, I also talked about coordination. And frankly, you don't need to be face-to-face to coordinate. In fact, if you look at the big tech firms that have always had these daily stand-ups, because people, sit on those groups from right around the world, they were never face-to-face. So what you have to do there is to synchronize people so that they're together, but they don't have to be actually physically together. That's a real issue around synchronous working and putting meetings in place. And then the third, which is focus. The most important thing for focus is that you have a period, I think minimally 2 hours, maximally 4 probably, where you're on your own and you're undisturbed. And if you're fortunate enough to have a home office that you can be undisturbed, then that's the place to do it. Otherwise, what we're noticing is some companies are actually building small offices near where they know their employees are living, so they can just go in and get some undisturbed time. So those combinations are the questions that you need to ask yourself. So the first question our listeners should be asking themselves, Alise, is, what do I actually do in my job? And what's the place and time that's best suited for me to be highly productive? And just a word on that, because we have really good data now on what's happened during the pandemic. And that's because, companies like TCS and Microsoft actually monitored what you were doing, not just their own employees, but lots of other employees. Here's the thing. The coordination where you have synchronous meetings is what you've spent most of your time doing. So if you're sitting at home or in your office today and thinking, oh my goodness, I've got another eight meetings today, that's because what Microsoft have found is you doubled the number of meetings that you had during COVID. Yeah. And so, one of the points about the redesigners of work is to ask yourself, why am I doing that? Why have I got all these meetings? So, we're really learning about what helps us to be productive. And what we've lost, by the way, is that focus time, the time when you're on your own, undisturbed by all the technology that surrounds you, and doing what humans do best, which is being creative, being thoughtful, and so on. So we are definitely in a stage now where we've done too much coordination, not enough focus. And as we get back to the office, we have to think more about cooperation.
Beautifully rendered. That just really sets the stage for what I want to talk about next. So again, I have not heard anybody describe it the way that you have this way. So what's interesting, a common complaint we hear about the remote workforce is that they are not as innovative as those who work together in a singular office at the same time. Yeah. And you explained so brilliantly that that's really determined by strong ties versus weak ties. So if you could kind of distinguish those for us, I think that's just brilliant and would really make a difference to people to understand.
No, well, thank you, Alise. So when you start off by saying, what's happening in my organization right now, understand it. One of the ways is to think about the job. But another way is to think about networks, because it turns out that most of us are productive, not just because we're individually brilliant, but rather because we're in groups where we work really well together. And it's really teams. In most of your companies, it's teams that are the driver of productivity, not individuals. And so you need to take a look at what sort of networks you have in your organization and how they've been affected by the pandemic. And as Alise said, you can think about your networks in two ways. One is the relationships that you have with people where you know them very well. It's very comforting to you. They probably help you get better than you are already. And we call network theorists call those strong ties. Those are the people you know very well. They call on you. In fact, they might be friends as well. And so those are really important for our mental health. The challenge with having lots of strong ties is that because you tend to choose people who are rather similar to you, you tend not to have a lot of diversity in your own sort of friendship group at work. And so what sociologists call weak ties, people you don't know so well, and there could be hundreds of those, are incredibly important, because they, in a way, if you think about a network, and in the book I sort of show it.
Yes.
Yeah, those are the people who help you connect way outside of your normal connectivity. And people who study innovation have found that very often the most innovative ideas come not from people who know each other well, talking to each other, because honestly, they're talking about the same thing. But
and what they already know, you say.
And they already know it. But rather where you have these weak ties with people you don't know very well, who could be in a different part of the business. They could be in an entirely different country. They could be in an entirely different organization. And they're telling you things that you don't know about. And that's really interesting for you. So what I've tried to do in the book, and in fact, I've done it really in all of my books, and I do a lot in my teaching, is to help people think about, as work is redesigned, what sort of network do I want? So one of the questions that people are feeling at the moment is, if I work from home all the time, it's going to change my networks. And we know that. We know right now, again, from Microsoft data, that people are saying, I'm not spending so much time with friends at work. And friends at work, we know, are really important to us. So we have to start asking ourselves, if we start going back into the office maybe 2 or 3 days a week, what is it we're going to do in the office that actually helps us to develop stronger friendships? Because if we go into the office simply to sit on our computer with our noise cancelling headphones on, that's not going to work for us.
Right. Beautifully said. And so again, you talk about in your book is the opportunity is to find ways to leverage those weak ties. That's what you really say in the book. And that's the opportunity. That's the thing that I want to put out to our listeners and viewers is that you're looking, especially in this idea of remote or virtual work. That's the opportunity to be able to really stir the pot, if you will. So that's important. Okay, so then I want to go into, you talk about what people want from work in the future. And this is important. This is not something that we've been talking about as far as I can remember for the last few years. Yeah. So you say to stay healthy, to have a balanced family life, to learn faster than machines, and to have a multi-stage life, which of course you've already mentioned. Those are, I've heard things like, yes, they want to learn and they want to grow and they want to advance, but this is a very different list, it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, I began to get a sense of that, Alise, about 10 years ago, because I, like you, have a consulting practice. It's called HSM. And one of the things that we do is we are the world's experts on putting together groups of people to talk about something important. And we have a platform that allows up to 100,000 people to talk about something that's really important. And about 10 years ago, we worked with one of the big professional service firms. And we did indeed have 100,000 people talking to each other about what they wanted at work. And we were really astonished by how many people talked about healthy living. They said, I want to be working in a place where I can I've still got time to run. I've still got time to eat healthy food. I've still got time to sleep, 8 hours. I don't want my sleep to be disturbed. And at the time I was thinking, why is everybody talking about staying healthy? And then when I began to realize that lots of people realized they were going to live longer and they wanted to live healthy, longer lives, then to be healthy, in your 60s and 70s and 80s, you have to put the foundation down a lot earlier. And these were mostly young people that we were talking to on this platform, and that's what they talked about. And Alise, at that stage, I realized about a decade ago that when people decide where they're going to work, for some of them, being in a healthy environment is really important. And part of the reason I'm very excited about changing the way we work is that it's going to give people an opportunity to live healthier lives, and also to build stronger connections with their friends, with their families, and importantly with their neighborhoods, into their neighbors, which is, we know that the one thing that makes us happy over the whole of our life is friendships. And so being able to strengthen our friendships, both in the office, but also at home with our neighbors, is a marvelous thing to be able to do.
Totally agree. And that's such an opportunity, and that beckons us all.
Yeah.
Another thing that I want to talk about that just really grabbed me, because I am an identity researcher and a meaning and work researcher. I've never, again, heard anybody distinguish the way that you do this idea of how the commute was a way for us to be able to cross time from one identity to another. And so when we lost that, and during the pandemic, we got into, I forget exactly what you call it, role spillover. So if you could just sort of talk to us a little bit about, why this importance of this identity separation and what happened in the pandemic, why it became problematic, that will help. We're going to talk more about that after the break, but let's set it up here.
Okay. So basically, when you're at home, you do all your home roles. In my case, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a wife, I'm a carer. And then when I go to work, I put on this sort of uniform. You can see I'm wearing it now. And I change my identity. And that makes it easier for me to separate being one thing to being another thing. But to do that, you have to learn a whole load of tricks.
Which we'll talk about more after the break. So let's grab our last and final break. Already it goes by so fast. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We've been on the air with Lynda Gratton. She's the author of Redesigning Work, How to Transform Your Organization and Make Hybrid Work for Everyone. We'll continue the conversation after that. See you then. Right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us, and welcome back to Working on Purpose. One other announcement I want to share with you. August of 21, I was able to get my second book out. It's an anthology, a collection of stories from women around the world. I literally went shopping for women across the world to share their intimate story of how they've discovered their purpose and are now serving from it. So it's called Passionately Striving and Why, an anthology of women who persevere mightily to live their purpose. It's on Amazon. I'm actually almost more proud of that book than I am my own first book. And now I'm out recruiting for men to share their stories. If you're just joining us, my guest is Lynda Gratton. She's the author of Redesigning Work, How to Transform Your Organization and Make Hybrid Work for Everyone. In addition to many other accomplishments, over a decade ago, Lynda founded HSM Advisory, which has supported more than 90 companies around the world to future-proof their business strategy. Amazing. Awesome. I'm going in your back pocket, by the way. This is amazing. Yes, you're welcome. Delightful to
Well, certainly when
cross
I go to
paths.
Japan, you certainly should come with me.
Oh, I totally will, my dear.
I am, oddly enough, I am one of the biggest selling authors in Japan.
That's amazing.
I know. The world has a very interesting way of creating opportunities for you.
Well, I have a suspicion that might be because of the name of your book, The 100 Year or something, because I know the Japanese are focused on longevity, et cetera. I wonder if that's one of the ties. So
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So we were talking about this notion of role spillover before. And so the way to facilitate boundary work, you have a couple things that I'd love to talk about here. One is replicating transitions. So if you could talk a little bit about how we can pull that off. This is fascinating.
So I think that, as I said, before the pandemic, many of us went into the office, and the period between leaving home and going to the office was a transitionary period. And this is what we did. We brought our coffee and we drank our coffee. We had to look at, the New York Times or whatever it is we're reading that morning. We shared, being a mum or a wife or, a carer, all the things we do at home. And we started to prepare ourselves for the job that we do. And in some cases, the identity that you need at home is very different from the identity you need at work. So that identity, managing those identities is really important. What happened during the pandemic, and I'm sure that so many of your listeners will really resonate with this, Alise, is that our boundaries just broke down. And I remembered that, I'd be sitting doing a great big Zoom with my students, and one of my kids would walk in, or the dog would drop something off, or I'd be thinking, oh my God, I put the oven on. I mean, that literally did happen once. And I've got everybody baked. Do you remember how we were all baking bread? And I've got some bread in the oven, and oh my goodness, that sort of stuff. So all the time, I was trying to run those two identities together. And what we know about the brain, and Alise, you know this as well as I, is that although we think that we're so brilliant at multitasking, in fact, there is no human who's brilliant at multitasking. What happens is that the brain has to flip from one thing to another. And each time it flips, it has to have a transition. And so, if I'm speaking to my MBAs as, this professor, Dr. Lynda Gratton, and I'm then thinking, oh my goodness, my bread is burning. My brain is having to switch from one identity, the brilliant cook, to the teacher. So one of the things that we have to think about as we move into hybrid work, and by hybrid, I mean, we spend some of the time in the office, some at home, or in a third place, or whatever we want to do, is we do have to think about how to manage our boundaries. And you'll see that people who historically have worked from home are really good at that. Now, how do they do it? Well, none of it's rocket science, Alise, but it's the sort of thing we all should be thinking about. Things like what you wear. So, for example, I put this on before I spoke to you today. I've put my jacket on specifically to speak to you today, because this, as I look at myself, this is Lynda Gratton, professional.
Yes.
That's one thing. Second thing is, you shut down around you so that you're not disturbed. And actually, people who work from home talk a lot about the mechanisms to make sure that they're not going to be disturbed. And then the third is to actually create an environment for yourself which has artifacts that reminds you what your work is. So I'm here sitting here in a hotel room in New York, but if you were talking to me from my home office in London, you'd see that I had a library behind me with my books in it. I'd have all my books on show. And that really reminds me of what my identity is as a professor, rather than my identity as a mum and as a grandmother. So, those boundaries are really important. And unless we learn how to control them, we're always going to be suffering, as it were, from trying to be two things simultaneously. And we just cannot do that.
Mm-hmm. I really think that helps people understand, and certainly contributes to a conversation I had a couple of weeks ago, which also partly addressed burnout, right? So, right, it certainly contributes if we're just confused as to our identities and they're overlapping in one another. It certainly would contribute to burnout.
Can I just say something else about burnout, Alise? And it comes back to something you and I spoke about earlier on, which is about too many meetings. You know, part of the reason that we're burnt out is we've had twice as many meetings as we had before the pandemic, and they're exhausting. You know, they're exhausting whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, whoever you are, they're exhausting. So part of the way of reducing burnout is to go through your diary and ask yourself, why am I having these meetings? And if it's just a meeting where you just happen to be invited and there's lots of other people, don't have it. And if you're a team leader, don't ask people to go into meetings unless they really need to be there and they really need to be contributing. And secondly, make sure that if you have a job that involves quite a lot of focused work, that you go through your diary and you take time out to think. Now, I'm lucky really because, you know, I write as you do. So in my diary, I have 4-hour stretches, which I say, writing my book. That's what it's called. And my assistant knows that she can't put stuff into it.
Right.
Now, that's rather grand. Here I am writing a book, but most of us also have grand tasks like that we have to do. And that's really important to your mental health, actually. So put that time in your diary. Don't let other people fill your diary with meetings.
Thank you for that reminder. That's so critical. All right. So because we're coming close to the end here, there's a couple more things I want to get out of it before you get away from me. So one of the other things that you talk about, which I think is critical, is you say beyond all of the ways of supporting home workers was the overriding view that it was crucial to focus performance management on outcomes, not presenteeism. That I think is so important. So what I've discovered, Professor, is that there's a trust problem, and people want to be able to see these people that are supposed to be working for them. They want to really know where they're at. So could you really speak to more of this focus on outcomes?
I think that's such a great question, Alise. And it really happened from the very beginning. You know, I wrote a Harvard Business Review article which came out in March 2021. It was the front cover of HBR. And actually that's what got the book going, because then Penguin, you know, said to me, could you write a book? And I said, yeah. And that's the sort of story of the book. But Fujitsu is a Japanese company, and Japanese companies are very keen on presenteeism. That's why everybody's got to be in the office all the time so they can see them. And they learned to trust their employees as they work from home. How did they do that? Well, again, you know, these are simple things like, if you notice with the tech companies, they have daily stand-ups where they talk to each other every day at the same time, let's say 10 o'clock in the morning, for half an hour. And they basically talk about, what am I going to do today? I don't think that's checking up. It's checking in.
Yes.
It's checking in and saying, tell us what you're doing today and what's working and what's not working. And if you start having those daily conversations about how are things going, checking in with people, then you don't need to check whether they're in the office or not, because you're talking to them. I think that's one thing. The second thing is, you know, there are amazing technologies now that help teams work together. And the more that you can use those technologies, and each company I know has got its own favorite, but those technologies really give you a sense of the momentum of a project. So you know if people are struggling, you know if they're not really pulling their weight. And then on a daily basis, you can go back and say, Alise, you know, you said you were going to do such and such, but you didn't do it. Can you tell us why? Why has that become a problem? So rather than just using presenteeism, i.e. I can see you, as the means of measuring and monitoring performance, we actually engage with the process, with the thing itself, the task itself, and find out where people are with that.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Yes. And that's so important for people to see as a possibility and opportunity to reach for. Many companies are not even close to that today, as you know. So then, of course, we have to talk about this next thing, because it's near and dear to my heart, and what I focus on is you talk about the team at CPP Investments, and you talk about how they discovered the importance of linking flexible practices to the purpose of the company, and that this gave it a real momentum because it aligned with the purpose of the company to invest in the long run. Say more about that. That is so enticing and critical, and definitely something I want our listeners to get. Well,
one of the things I do in the book, Alise, as you know, is I give lots of examples of what companies are doing. And I think some of the most enticing examples of as you've said, is where what they're doing about work links to what they think about their purpose. So CPP Investment, a Canadian investment fund, it invests your pensions, if you're Canadian, for the long term. Pension funds are long-term investors. They're not moving in and out. They're not doing day trading. And so they really want their analysts and the people who are managing those funds, they want them to stay over years. They don't want them to be moving in and out of the organization. And so what they've said is, what can we do to entice you to stay? And one of the things they discovered during the pandemic, you remember, Alise, that in March of 2020, if you had, like they have, a workforce that came from all over the world, and one of your people happened to be Portuguese, let's say, they'd gone home to Portugal for Christmas, they couldn't get back to to Canada, right. Or they'd gone to Australia, they couldn't get back, wherever. So they suddenly found that their most talented people who have many nationalities, had gone back often to their home country to see their family and couldn't get back again. Now, luckily, they'd invested in some really sophisticated and secure cloud technology. And they found that people could work from home. They could work from Portugal. They could work from Argentina. They could work. And not only could they work from home, but actually, because they measure productivity increased. And so when everybody came back to Canada as the pandemic was, less virulent, one of the questions that they asked was, hang on, if you could work from home, maybe we should think a bit more about that. And what they did is they said, we're going to start building a strategy. And actually, by the way, it's not straightforward because there's a lot of tax implications, but where you can work anywhere you want for 3 months a year. Now, the reason that's so interesting, and as you said, it links into their purpose, is that the guy who talked to me about that, Darren, and you'll see it in the book, he says, Lynda, if we were just employing people for a year, the last thing we want is them to be away for 3 months. We just can't manage that. But if we know that they're here for the long term and we want them to stay and we want to keep their knowledge, then this is part of the investment that we're making in them. And I think it's a very enticing offer, by the way. If I was sitting right now in an investment firm where I'd been told I had to get back to the office full time, and it's the American 2 weeks a year holiday, and I saw that one of the competitors in this war for talent had said, you can work anywhere you want for 3 months a year. Whoa, that's a pretty enticing prospect, isn't it? And one of the points I'm making right now, Alise, is that, if you're in a company where the war for talent is hotting up, and I think it is, as you said at the beginning, everywhere, then you need to look at what your competitors are doing, because you might be surprised that even if you're not being very creative, some of your competitors will be, and they'll be enticing your people away.
Yes. Poof, they're gone.
Poof,
okay.
And you don't know until they've resigned.
Exactly. So definitely one thing I want you to speak on, if you can, just briefly, is I've had a few conversations with leaders who are very smugly tell me, well, I'm not really too worried about this shift in the workplace because the economy is going to downturn and all this stuff won't be necessary. It really won't be important. And they're very smug about it. Yeah. What's your view on that?
Well, I think we will have a recession. It's just inevitable, actually, given everything that's happening in the world right now. But actually, the pool of talented people is not going to suddenly grow. And that's because of demographics. There isn't an endless pool of young people. Every country, including the US, is aging at the moment. So if you think there's an endless supply of smart 24-year-olds, there really isn't. So you have to actually be creative about the offer that you make to employees. But if you're a CEO, you have to be sure that the offer also enables those people and your company to be as productive as possible. And that's why, for me, the first question on redesigning work is, what can I do to make myself more productive? And if you answer that positively, then I don't think a CEO is going to be so smug about, well, there's a huge supply of talented people out there, because frankly, there isn't. And there's never going to be, even if we have a recession.
Yeah, and I would just simply add, why would you want to go back? Why do we want to go back? Why don't we want to go forward, right? Let's create the future we all want to live in. So
I agree. I
we've
agree.
we've done it, Dr. Gratton. We've managed to get through the whole show already so quickly. You know, the show is listened to by people around the world who are trying to create workplaces where people actually want to come to work and do their best. We have inspirational leaders that lead them to their greatness, and we do business that betters the world. What would you like to leave them with today?
Well, I think Alise, your point is, don't go back. I've been studying work for 30 years. This is the only time I've ever felt we can change, we can change, we can change. So let's think about this as an opportunity to change.
Brilliant, Dr. Gratton. It has been just a delight to get to know you, to read your book, to drink it in, and share it with listeners and viewers around the world. Thank you so much for being you and doing the work that you've been doing.
Thank you very much, Alise, and thank you so much for inviting me on your wonderful show today.
Very welcome. Listeners and viewers, if you want to learn more about Dr. Lynda Gratton and her work, her books, start by visiting her website, personal website. It's lindagratton.com. Let me spell that for you. LYNDAGRATTON, lindagratton.com. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on the air with Judy Winslow, a brandologist who helps companies sustainably scale and develop cultures that enable people to thrive. Next week, we'll be on the air with Marie Gervais talking about her book, The Spirit of Work, where she offers a high-level yet approachable model in rethinking how we view and structure work. Her book delves into the fascinating relationship between people and work, combining ancient wisdom, modern science, spirituality, and real-world examples to share insights into developing a soul-sustaining workplace culture. See you there. Remember that work is at least a third of our life, so let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.